Hello and welcome everyone to our first session of the day about the future of economy. We're going to be talking about representation and inclusion in AI, how applying an inclusion lens in product development results in untapped economic opportunities. And we'll be talking with Jason Scott, head of startup developer ecosystems at Google, and Dr. Maisha Gray Diggs, senior director, talent acquisition at Twitter. Welcome, Jason and Maisha, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. Jason, let's dive right in. How does your current role uniquely position you to drive inclusion in the startup ecosystem?
Yes, so as head of startup developer ecosystem for the US, my whole role is around really coming in and helping startups around the growth stage. And why that's pivotal and kind of important around, and why it's important to have an inclusive mindset around that stage is we're really helping go from MVP to launch. When it comes to product design and development, we're really thinking about data sets and starting to think about machine learning and how they can apply their data to machine learning as well, or apply machine learning to their data sets, as well as growth and customer acquisition and teams and leadership. So everything around growing your team, your product, and your data. So it's really awesome for me to see these startups really go from early stages to launch.
Why do you believe that inclusion in product development is economically impactful and really forward thinking? Like, what's the why behind thinking about inclusion?
Yeah, I think you'll see, especially in these times, right, as startups both shift online but become more global in scale and the reach that they're trying to have. When you're developing your products, you can't just build for your local communities, right? You really have to think about what are the needs of the customers the addressable market that you're trying to address, and really untapped opportunities globally, right? So if you're building a product, we at Google, we often talk about the next billion users. And those next billion users are those people that are coming online across the globe that we really are trying to build for, right? And if we just build for folks here in the US, or more specifically folks in the Bay Area, we're really missing out on a global economy, right?
You use the word untapped market and untapped possibilities. Can you talk about that in the context of the economy? What does that mean for folks who may not get it, who may not be thinking with this inclusive mindset?
Yeah, I mean, you've probably experienced this, right? Especially in the Bay Area, a lot of founders, like I just said, like build for their local environment. So there are folks who build for the techies of San Francisco, or build for the hustle bustle of New York City, or build for other founders. But at the same time, they're missing out on building for the folks in rural Texas or rural Northwest or the Midwest, or folks in down in Guadalajara, up in Canada, right? And when you really apply this inclusive mindset early, you're able to really start, instead of retroactively applying inclusion to your product development process, you're really able to increase your addressable market when you're talking to investors, really talk about an addressable market that is beyond the techie in San Francisco, right? And I see that mistake, I guess, or lack of inclusive mindset so often when founders are at the earliest stages of developing their products.
Yeah, I see it on my side of the house when we think about building the teams, right, that are going to then go into that product development cycle, wanting to make sure that you have an inclusive workforce, a more inclusive team to then bring those inclusive mindsets that then go into the inclusion in the product development. So it really is from even before you start thinking about the product, it's really in the teams that you put together. With this being an AI and tech conference, can we talk a little bit about some examples where some inclusive inputs may have been better or be beneficial in that product development cycle, so that our viewers have some real live tangible examples?
Tangible things.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give Google examples because being a Google employee, I feel I don't want to put any startups on the spotlight, other startups on the spotlight. But thinking about Google, right? We've all used image search is a good example, right? And we've all, many of us, this being an AI and machine learning conference, as you said, are familiar with vision APIs and those sorts of things. So when we're thinking about recognition of photos, something that came up quite often when we were developing those vision APIs is that, think about foods, for instance. If your data sets are limited to just, your initial data sets are just limited to foods that we often consume in North America, pasta or pizza or those sorts of things, then you're leaving out, and you realize very quickly that these APIs are horrible at identifying things like maybe pad thai, right? Or the foods that are Southeast Asian in descent or African in nature. And what we realize quite often is that we needed to expand our data sets to not alienate an entire continent of customers that use our products and not make it inaccessible or unusable for those customer bases. And that's one example. You can think about app development. A lot of founders tell me that they're building for lower income or developing communities. But then I often ask them, then why is your product iOS first, right? When a lot of those communities are on Android or maybe only use SMS. And it's interesting to see, or for instance, another good example is, why are you building a web app when a lot of those communities that you're targeting don't even have laptops at home, right? And you see that often that people are, again, with the right intentions, but not necessarily thinking about and having the level of empathy that's necessary to build for these communities, and not building inclusion deliberately into their product development processes to then make sure that they're building the right products for the right people. Again, another good example that I experience on a daily basis, many of us in opening up Gmail or iMessage, we are using text recognition or autocomplete and those sorts of things. But imagine if the frustration if autocomplete or autocorrect never works for you and your community, right? Imagine if Siri, Alexa, or Google Assistant doesn't speak your language and the language that you speak with your peers and your friends and your family. Imagine that feeling of alienation, and this product is not built for me, that consumers feel, and that these companies then and startups quite often miss out on this entire consumer base, right? Because then they're retroactively trying to apply inclusion, when having that inclusive voice earlier on, when you're building your team or when you're going through the product development process would have highlighted those things from the start, and you could build for a larger addressable market, like I was saying earlier, from the beginning.
I feel that every day when I get on my phone, I won't tell you which one I have, and it autocorrects my name, my very ethnic Swahili name. It autocorrects it every single time in what I do on my phone. So preach on that one. Can you give us some examples of when it works, right? That there's this upside to, like, again, we're going to hit this home with our audience, that inclusion at the very beginning and throughout the product development cycle is so important. So can you give us some examples of upside that people who may not still be believing that it's important?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you one like very recent example. I actually, when we were getting prepared for this session, I actually had someone message me through LinkedIn, I believe, asking around would we be able to use a platform that includes subtitles, right? That recognizes voice and then is able to translate that to subtitles that aid in their conference experience, right? And luckily, a lot of these platforms now, Meet, Zoom, etc., are doing that and incorporating this into their product. And think about how many new customers that traditionally would not have been able to have this digital conference experience in a way that was useful to them, or that they could really engage with the content, if that had not been part of the product development roadmap from the beginning, right? Or if it had not come in more recently. And also think about, had it come in earlier. And I think there are a lot of those examples that you see constantly, and you see. I mean, I know you're familiar with more consumer products standpoints, and you see so many consumer products companies these days that are now building for, they're realizing that the hair textures that they built for in the past were only inclusive of a certain part of the population, and now there's an entire population that they're now able to tap into because they've now incorporated those voices in their product development processes and in their employee base, which I'm sure you experience quite often in thinking about recruitment. But even if you don't necessarily have a diverse team, by having the architecture around your product development processes to make sure you're eliminating those blind spots, you're able to really, again, build for a larger addressable market and really be more successful. And it's a win-win for everyone, right? Well, you're opening up economic opportunities for you as a company, but you're also able to have your products be useful to those beyond your bubble of San Francisco or beyond your bubble of New York, et cetera.
So I'm going to encourage our virtual audience to start populating questions in the Slido while I get to keep firing some good ones, at Jason. So you've given us the upside. You've talked a lot. Can you tell folks about how to do it, right? How would you advise them to incorporate inclusion in the work they do in the product development cycle? So a little bit of the toolkit. How do you do this?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the first one, which again you probably will resonate with, and the kind of the most obvious one is just by making sure your team has as many voices as possible, right? And being inclusive from a recruitment standpoint. I know that sometimes you're balancing both things. You're trying to build a team quickly, and sometimes it's easiest to just bring on your friends or bring on the folks that you know within your community. But being proactive about that up front and making sure that on your product team or on your team in general, you're able to include as many voices that are representative of other communities. I think secondarily, though, is just acknowledging that we all have blind spots, right? We all are from a specific community, and we all aren't necessarily, like, even if I have as diverse of a team as possible, like if I'm building a product for someone in continental Africa or Eastern Europe or in Asia, I will have blind spots. If my team is a team of two, I'm not likely to be able to have representation from all those places. So in your product development processes, don't just test on folks in your local environment. Get as many voices from the communities, from a diverse set of communities as you can, right? And we do that as much as we can, both with Googlers from offices around the world, but also in just going out into the field and really throughout the process from ideation to launch, making sure that you continue to check, and then continue to check even after launch, right? That your products, that you're getting this feedback from these voices, this diverse set of voices, and being intentional. I think if you take nothing else away from it, just be intentional about inclusion and incorporating inclusion in your product development processes.
Do you have some products, some tech products or non-tech products that you have been a fan, as you are passionate about this work of inclusion in the product development cycle, that you've been on the sideline kind of cheering them along, saying, yep, this is when inclusion in the product development cycle, when we get it right, it looks like. Are there any examples of products you can share with us?
Yeah, let me think. I mean, I'm sure that, there's so, again, as a representative of someone who came from a very Southern Black family, I'm very excited about so many startups now opening up offices, for instance, in Atlanta, and making sure that they're kind of they're incorporating the voices of the Southern but other Southern Black families down there in Atlanta that I see represented now in the product. So definitely from like personal care standpoint, from the consumer products that I engage with constantly, but on a technical standpoint, yes, again, my example of I was very impressed and excited when folks started using natural language processing to add subtitles to their video conference calls and those sorts of things, to really make sure. Those are the ones I'm impressed about, are the ones where I'm like, where you're pleasantly surprised as you're engaging, when you're like, oh wow, that was great, that was an awesome innovation that really showed that they were thinking about making their products accessible for a broader audience. But yeah, I see a lot of wins from time to time in my startups, and again, we try our best to guide our startups in this way through our kind of product road mapping and workshops that we expose them to. But yeah, there are a lot I can speak to for sure.
So we got a great question, as I lead inclusion in the talent acquisition space, there's visible diversity that it's, very easy to say, yep, I have a Black or Latinx person, I have a female or gender conforming person, et cetera. How do you get past that when you think about diversity of experience, diversity of thought, and including that into the product development cycle within the teams? What advice?
Within the teams themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Well, I think in general, and making sure that, and you can hold me accountable for making sure that I'm understanding the question correctly. But I think in general, making sure that again, you're not necessarily going to always have those voices on your team, but you can proactively go out to incorporate them within your product development processes, right? So you can go out into these communities to gather feedback on your product, your MVP. You can go out into these communities to gather feedback before your launch and during your launch. And I think just being, again, intentional and proactive about it is what I would say generally.
How, Jason, the questions are getting tough. How do we ensure, as you talked about, not wanting people to go get what's comfortable, go get their friends? How do we ensure that we avoid social cohesion and combat that, when we're putting together these teams, and making sure that when we do bring in diverse perspectives, that they're heard, that their voice doesn't fall flat? So that's a different, we've included in one sense, but then to make sure people are heard is inclusion in a different sense.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to, one, ensuring that they have a platform for their voice, right? And again, I cannot say enough. Like, it's not just about having those people on your team. It's making sure that they have a way to give feedback to your products. At Google, for instance, we have our dog fooding that is, one, anonymous in many ways. So like, no one's able to. You don't have to feel bad if you have some negative feedback or constructive feedback about this product. Like, you can give that feedback in an anonymous way, and you do have a platform and a channel to do so. And I think it doesn't have to be as structured as a formal dog fooding process, but making sure that you have a way for those voices to be heard and for them to have equal say and equal kind of volume. And they don't necessarily have to be on the product team, but making sure that you have a mechanism for that feedback to translate across from all over your company to your product development team.
So this one is spicy, and it's for both of us. How would we encourage a startup to think about recruiting differently, recruiting diversity differently when they don't have the same resources as big tech?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's tough, right? And I think one is just like making sure, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, right? You're not going to be able to check even at Google, right? We have hundreds of thousands of people. We're not checking every box, and there are a lot of voices that still aren't necessarily represented. But and definitely that's the case for a startup of 2 to 5 people. But I think it's, again, if you don't do it, and I'm sure you would agree with this, if you don't do it from the start and at least think of, can I at least hire someone that has some difference in perspective than me, whether it be where they're coming from, whether it be from the lens of gender, the lens of race, or the lens of just where they were born. Like, is there some level of diversity that I can start with in my small team, and then hope that just propagates and continues to grow throughout? And I think, again, like, understanding your blind spots, like, we all have them. And I think the challenge is there are a lot of SF and just big city tech companies that don't acknowledge that from the start, right? They don't acknowledge that they have these blind spots, and that they're going to proactively ensure that they are gathering as much feedback from other communities outside of what they have on their team during product development.
And I think the build that I would have to that is that these startups are inherently in a high risk stage. And so I think they have the opportunity to take risks and be scrappier than some of the bigger tech companies that are bound by and concerned about legal risk and legal ramifications of some of their actions. And so I think the startups are actually better positioned to be scrappy, and to pivot fast. So if this doesn't work, try something different. Meaning, you can go to some places, you can do a lot of more small fairs, you can bring folks in and do intimate things where, when you're recruiting the numbers that Google recruits or the numbers that Twitter recruits, sometimes it's harder to do that grassroots touching, letting people in. I think it would go a long way with these diverse communities to be invited in by a tech startup to look and see. I've
100%.
experienced that with my family when they've come in to both Twitter and Microsoft and have been blown away, like, oh my gosh, what is going on in here? So I think you have space as a startup to do things that big tech is afraid to do.
Yeah, and I honestly think that people are also, admittedly, sometimes more forgiving of a startup, right? So I would say not being afraid to make some mistakes and know that you're going to make some mistakes along the way, but like learn from them, right? Don't necessarily like acknowledge, again, in the same way that you should acknowledge that you have blind spots, acknowledge that you're going to make some mistakes along the way, but that's how you learn and create products, right? If you're always scared of making that mistake, you might end up with a product that, again, you just completely alienated an entire part of your customer base because you just never took the time to engage with them.
Yep. I have a great question in here about inclusive language, and it came up as the word, a reaction to the term dog fooding. And thinking about how is that inclusive language in the product development lifecycle to use that term dog fooding? What does it say about customers, their voice, their role? So have you guys thought about a different word for dog fooding as you think about inclusive language? I know Twitter has recently done this with our code. We're doing it on the people team as we think about even is the word talent not an inclusive word. So any thoughts on an alternative, Jason, as we think about inclusive language in the product development cycle?
Yeah, and I will admit, I think similar to what you said, like there are lots of efforts right now to review language around all the functions around Google, and I think a lot of my startups as well. And I think we do have some way to go, and I will say that I think we have a lot of years to unbuild when it comes to some of the words that we use. But I think proactive, I think that's part of it. I think and getting feedback from folks. Going back to my last point, not being afraid to make a mistake and get that feedback, but then also doing something with that feedback. And I think like that is I love that we had this question because I think people are now giving more of these types of points of feedback, but then I think companies are finally starting to be a little bit more receptive and adaptive to the feedback, and I hope, I can only say I can't speak for every team at Google, I can't speak for every startup, but I'm hoping that in this time people are starting to incorporate and take action on that feedback on their teams, respective teams. So hopefully we will see. But I'm hopeful. I'd like to remain optimistic about these sorts of things. So,
before we wrap up, Jason, any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I mean, again, you're going to make mistakes, and I think it's about not being afraid to do that, but also being proactive. And I tell all of my startups, just be intentional about your inclusion and thinking about it throughout every single step. So yes, acknowledge that maybe our team isn't as diverse as we want it to be, or not representative of the customer base that we're trying to reach. So let's make sure that we're incorporating that even more so in our product development process, or even more so in our customer feedback, and just understanding that it's never going to be perfect, especially nothing in the startup is perfect, but at the same time, you can be proactive and you can be intentional. And I think if you take nothing else away from that, just acknowledge that we all have blind spots, and we all should be taking action to be intentional around how do we have inclusive voices within the development of our products that we're trying to do to change the world.
And with that, Irina, I will turn it over to you. Thank you all for joining us today. And I appreciate you being here, everyone, because that means you are thinking about bringing equity and access to tech. And that's the start, as Jason said.
Thank you, Myisha and Jason. That was an absolutely fascinating conversation about fostering environments that really provide an opportunity for inclusivity in tech. I mean, I certainly walked away with a few new ideas of my own. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Saturday.
You too. Happy Saturday. All right, attendees. Our next session will be beginning in 5 minutes at 8:30. To join it, please go ahead and click the link on to the next session under the stream under this video. So we'll see you there.